few quick notes from the editor before we begin this episode. This is part 2 of a 2-part conversation, so you should go back and listen to part 1 if you haven't already. Also, a content warning, as this episode includes discussions about abuse, neglect, and violent crimes. Discretion is advised, and if these topics are triggering for you, then it may be best to skip this episode.
In today's episode, welcome Katherine Yoder, Executive Director and Leigha Shoup, Deputy Director from the Adult Advocacy Centers from here in Ohio. Welcome to the show, y'all.
If we're utilizing somebody for their skills, for their knowledge base, outside of disability, there's another term that needs to go along with that. Because a lot of times if we give people titles, let's say, and then we only give people with disabilities the title of self-advocate, that kind of is our own way of keeping ourselves in a box and not really demanding what we're worth. So we're really focused on making sure people with disabilities are not just utilized, like Leigha said, as a token, but really are at every layer of the organization. And that's something that we've been actually quite successful on. We also are really big on getting people trained in this field. So Ohio is the only state in the nation that has someone whose first language is ASL, American Sign Language, trained now as a forensic interviewer. And if you think about it, it's really cool. So essentially she can have a conversation with somebody else in her language, and closed captioning would be there for all of us who don't speak ASL. And the really neat thing about it is not only is it common sense, but it's also so much more trauma responsive because you don't have all these interpreters in the room. So that's another element we're looking at, is utilizing people with disabilities as forensic nurse examiners, as forensic interviewers, because we're all over the place. Our community is so big and so inclusive that we are not just victims. We are not just survivors. You know, we're the judges. We are the nurses. We are the leaders in the community. And those are things that we really need to work on with representation as well.
Yeah, that is really cool. It's cool that people from organizations and agencies are giving people with disabilities leadership roles. Like for me, I work for my provider agency. I help them train their staff how to work with people with disability and introduce them to the DD community. Like I'll take them to a conference. I was like, come on, join me. And so they learn something. So I have like a remix. A self-advocate consultant. It's still self-advocate and still self, but I do all the mixture of both. I have all the flavors.
Yeah,
you know how the 31 flavors in Baskin
Robbins.
Well, well, I have the 31 flavors of Marcy Strotter and my Stir It Up and Keep It Cooking book. And so I like stirring up and keep it cooking with them and teaching them things and teaching them about how other individuals, about remote support and different things like that, and how to interact with remote support and how to remote support interacts with us. So I do all those flavors, and it's good to have somebody that an employer and someone that believes in you, because
I just wanted to jump in with one thing that you said at the beginning, because this is something that we have ascribed to in the disability community. And as soon as you said it, I jumped right on it. You were like, you know, that we're being allowed or we're being given these type of positions. You know, as far as leadership positions, we're not being given them. They're not handing it out. The issue is that we as a community need to understand that we have a place at the table just like everybody else. And whether or not somebody offers us a seat or not, we belong there. And so a lot of times we're waiting for someone to come by and validate us and say, oh, you're an expert, or yes, you can definitely try to do this work that's never been done. There's a really good quote. There's a poet named June Jordan. She passed away a while ago, but she said, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And I think that's a really powerful quote and kind of goes into what you're saying, Marcy. We belong here. No one has to give us anything. We just need to claim what's ours. And we are leaders. We are people who have specific knowledge, and we can make really innovative and groundbreaking work actually be implemented in society and having, really big outcomes from that. And so I think that's something that a lot of times we get in this mindset, we're waiting for permission, or we're waiting for someone to say, yes, you're worthy to do this work, or to set out on your own, or that. And the issue is that all of us have that capacity. It just kind of depends on what that looks like for you. All of us are capable of doing something for somebody else. And it could be a small step, it could be a big step. But it is something where it's like, nobody's going to fix these things for us. This is something that, we're going to have to come together and fix for ourselves. And the big piece is for Leigha and I, we're taking a step towards coming up with solutions, but that's all it is a step. The whole issue is so big. We need other people to be walking with us. And so we're just saying to the disability community, don't wait for permission or for someone to say that you're worth it, or that, you have the ability to be a leader. You already have that. You don't need that from somebody else. And I think that's something that is kind of more of ingrained in us, that we have to kind of wait our turn or be given something, that it's not something that we can claim. And I think that kind of mental shift is really, really important. But what you do, your example, Marcy, is perfect, because you are a consultant, but your consultant and the work that you do does focus on disability advocacy. So that, your title and those kind of things go directly into what you're doing. And you've historically been phenomenal at it. I mean, you're a household name throughout Ohio, but better than anybody, how much work needs to be done. And so, that's one of the things that we're looking at, is when we're using language, when we're interacting with people, just taking into account, some of the language that we use is meant to keep people kind of in their place. A lot of times I'll hear from law enforcement and people, so-and-so can't be entered because they're nonverbal. Well, if you put that in another context, that's victim blaming, but we don't look at it like that in the disability community, because we're used to people making those kind of comments. So I think it's kind of one of those things where we need to take a step back and look at the things that we're tolerating and really kind of determine, maybe it's time for us to take another step in this area. And like I said, it's not a step that anyone can take alone. It's something we have to do as a community, as a movement, as a disability movement. A lot of people think about those years around ADA as being like the tip of, disability advocacy. And it's not. It's one moment of disability advocacy. We need people still out there fighting. And I think that this year, at least for me, the 33rd birthday of the ADA is a little bit different for me this year, because this is the first year that Lois Curtis isn't going to be around to kind of celebrate and to kind of be included in podcasts and stuff like she has been in the past, because she passed away. But I think it's really, really important for all of us to take a time and reflect, because we always focus so much on what we're doing and how we're seen and what our own little contribution will be. And, at least for me, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Lois Curtis. And so many of us. And I think, a lot of what we also need to do is just kind of take some time and be grateful for those that came before us and tell their stories. So much of our history gets lost because no one's telling our stories.
Another thing I have for you is, you recently released a white paper on forensic interviews for crime victims' disabilities as a ADA acronym before we dive into the white paper. Can you tell us what this means?
Sure. So we did recently do a large scale, I guess, rollout with the concept of that forensic interviews qualify as an ADA accommodation. So what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is if you have a crime victim with a disability and they are in need of a forensic interview, that individual or that survivor has the right to have access to an expert or specially trained forensic interview to provide that interview to them. And that interviewer or that forensic interviewer has specialized training in how to interview someone with a victim with disabilities. So the concept around it being an ADA accommodation is, and this was part of the white paper, which is on our website, is that if someone is a crime victim, they can say like, I have a disability and I want a forensic interview and I want it to be done by someone who has specialized training. And that now qualifies as an accommodation under the ADA. They can say all of these words, right? They can say, I have the right to this. And law enforcement and other multidisciplinary team members that are a part of the investigation have to provide that accommodation because it is a reasonable request. Now that, we are, the AACs has started in 2019, now that we've created these protocols and are training individuals all around the nation, not just in Ohio, on how to provide these interviews, and our agency ourselves are providing interviews. This is a reasonable request. And so our rollout, like I said, included a white paper, but also we did a webinar that talked all about what does this mean, the rollout, what do you mean by how can someone request an ADA accommodation in this manner? A lot of times multidisciplinary team members, and this kind of was reminding me of this as Katherine was talking, we talk about switching purviews and Sherry gives us a different viewpoint on, like, for example, forensic nurse examinations. We think about multidisciplinary teams, and I think about the teams that I've worked with in the past. It's not always common knowledge or common sense, I guess, to think, oh, how would someone access this? How would they access this service if they have a disability? And that may seem like, of course, why aren't people thinking of this? Everyone should be thinking about this. The problem is a lot of times no one is thinking of this, right? That's literally why we exist as an agency. So for someone to be able to understand that they have the right to request this is the first stepping stone in being able to get the right equitable service. So not only do victims have victims' rights under Marcy's law, but they also have additional protections under the ADA now with this type of concept of asking for an accommodation.
And if I could just piggyback on Leigha, because that's literally what I usually do. Is that the only thing that might be useful is, let me just kind of explain what is a forensic interview, because essentially what happens is somebody is a victim of crime and law enforcement is called. And what usually happens is law enforcement will conduct an interview on the victim. And then based upon that interview, and additional, investigative and evidence collection, all those things are brought together and a determination is made whether or not to bring charges and those kind of things. So what ends up happening, though, is that initial interview with law enforcement, if the person has a disability, historically does not go well. And we have a ton of statistics that will support that. And that has to do with, most of the time, law enforcement is not specially trained. Also, law enforcement comes at it from an interrogation standpoint. That's how they're trained. And so a lot of times the disability community doesn't really respond well to that. And so, there's that component. So what we literally do is we can kind of be used as a support by law enforcement, by DODD, by county boards. We're not a replacement, we're just support. And so what can be done is a request can be made that a forensic interview is done. Forensic interviewing up until now has always been something just for kids You'll hear of Child Advocacy Centers, CACs. That's where they take kids a lot of times to be forensically interviewed. And that's for kids who have been victims of abuse or neglect or other crimes. So what we've kind of done is taken that concept and adapted it and changed it around for the disability community. We have really great partnerships here in Ohio with the local child advocacy centers. And since we are in the process of trying to get funds for a center and for mobile units so that we'd be able to actually go to people. In the meantime, we're using Ohio CACs. They're allowing us the space, which we are very, very appreciative of. So, you know, what ends up happening is law enforcement would get in touch with us. We would sign an MOU with law enforcement. We've had cases with people who maybe they don't want interaction with law enforcement, and they have very, very valid reasons. It can be triggering or, you know, some historical reason. And so we can do our MOUs with prosecutors, so we can provide that alternative response too. So essentially the person would meet us at the place where the forensic interview would be conducted. That person would go into a room with just the forensic interviewer. It's just a normal size room. There'll be a camera usually in a corner, and that will be pointed out to the person because the video, it's going to be recorded, both audio and visually, to make sure that would be able to be used in a court of law. And then the forensic interviewer essentially would sit down, and there's a structure for using forensic interview techniques. So a certain way to conduct that interview. The person that's being interviewed has the right to agree to a forensic interview or not. They can leave at any time. Our position is, even if the person has a guardian, if the person does not want a forensic interview, we will not do it. And so it's really also an opportunity for that victim of crime to really have the space to kind of share, you know, what occurred. And a lot of times people are going to do that in different ways. And so we have a protocol specifically for interviewing people who don't communicate traditionally through speech. So if somebody can blink or use gestures or grunt, we can do a baseline, which is not very difficult at all. You know, if you're able to say, look, you know, blink twice for yes, one for no. There's cases, actually one particularly here in Ohio that went to the Supreme Court involving a victim of crime that was shot. And when he was shot, he became immediately paralyzed. And law enforcement had to interview him very, very quickly because he wasn't expected to survive. And he did pass away, but they interviewed him and he was able to blink his answers. And that case, the perpetrator was charged and went to jail, and they tried to appeal the case saying, look, the communication that was used, you know, is not really going to be fair to the perpetrator's rights. And the Ohio Supreme Court upheld the conviction. So there is case law to support some of this. And let me give you an example, Marcy. Actually, Leah, can you, we had a case, it's actually a really, really good case that we use as an example. Like I said, you know, our interviews and all of that, you know, there isn't any cost associated with it. It's through VOCA, but we got a case out of Southern Ohio from a real rural sheriff. And I'm going to have Leah go ahead and tell you that story, because I think sometimes the concept of what we're talking about just really sounds a little bit out there. And so sometimes providing actual examples really kind of makes it a little bit clearer. So Leah, if you could.
Yeah, for sure. So the case is essentially working with a sheriff's department, a very rural sheriff's department that had been called out to a residential type of home. And they had said, okay, you know, we're here because someone had called and said this person was assaulted. They took down a police report. They were told by the person giving the report, this is who the victim was, this is who the perpetrator was, or the person who did it. And and they just said, okay. And, they had reached out to us saying, we think we have all the information we need, but we are opening the door. If you all would like to come and provide a forensic interview to this victim or this survivor, we would be open to it, but we feel pretty confident we know the situation and who the perpetrator is. So we go out and we provide this forensic interview. We were told that the victim is nonverbal. This is what we were told, nonverbal. So again, come and try to do an interview, but kind of like good luck, but you can come. So our expert interviewer went out and provided this interview. And of course, used the exact protocol that Katherine was just talking about, the forensic interview protocol on how to interview people who do not speak. So our amazing Adana forensic interviewer took care of it, went out there and did this forensic interview. And when you do a forensic interview, you heard Katherine say that they're audio and visually recorded, and they're typically also shown live on a closed circuit television where a multidisciplinary team is watching live from a different room, like so on a TV or something like that. And so they're watching our forensic interview do this forensic interview. And she finishes the interview and comes back out and talks to the multidisciplinary team. And I don't want to like embellish, but I think they were shocked and surprised because the interview brought to light the real facts. And the real facts were that the perpetrator that was named on the police report was not the actual perpetrator. The person giving the report was actually the perpetrator. And so if that individual was never interviewed, never provided that specialized forensic interview, law enforcement would have never known who the actual perpetrator was, right? Because they were being led in kind of a different direction based on the police report. And so based on that interview and based on the testimony of the victim, law enforcement was able to correct the trajectory of their investigation and actually make an appropriate arrest. So that's a very small example of how and why specialized forensic interviewing is so extremely important, and why requesting the forensic interview under the ADA can be crucial. It can potentially have major impacts on a case and investigation. So that's kind of how it applies to in the moment.
And the only one thing, and I think I neglected to mention this, is that when we talk about utilizing it as an ADA accommodation, we're of course putting it in the context that it would have to meet the ADA requirements, the criteria. So when we're talking about like Title II of the ADA, we're talking about reasonable and effective communication. And that's really kind of our sweet spot as far as why forensic interviewing is needed, because the way that it's currently being conducted is not effective or reasonable. And so this specialized type of interviewing is an accommodation. It is not something that because you have a disability, you have to request it. It's totally voluntary. It's another support. But it is a support that was created to address the high rate of victimization and the lack of prosecution from a disability lens, which we haven't really had before. So that's what kind of makes it exciting.
All righty. Well, you have answered all my questions, and one thing that I would like to know is, how did the AAC release the white paper?
That's a really good question. So we did it kind of in tandem as two parts. So we released the white paper virtually, I guess you could say. We did a lot of outreach and connection. So whether that would be through email, through connection, like making a lot of phone calls, having conversations with people. But then we also paired that with a webinar. So we were able to host and provide a presentation through a webinar type of style of a format that was recorded and is recorded on our website. But it allows people to kind of understand the white paper. It breaks down the white paper, right? It really goes into detail explaining what we've kind of talked about very briefly today. But and you also get to hear from several different presenters, which is kind of cool. And it allows more in-depth understanding of what the white paper kind of talks about. So I guess the quick way to answer that is we released it in two different kinds of ways.
And Marcy, I know,
Alrighty.
Marcy, if I could just add one more thing, I know that because of your background, you always like to know what can people who are listening, what can they do next? And I think what I would suggest is get on our website. We have a resource section that's actually growing. And all of it, everything that's on there is free. Review that, utilize that if you want. Another thing is read the white paper. These things are not just created in a vacuum. We want the disability community to be able to explain why this stuff is needed and necessary. And the way that that happens is through, getting more informed about the issues, whether it's victimization of people with disabilities or forensic interviewing or anything like that. So those are all things that can be done. But one really concrete thing is to take our ADA paper and have a discussion with your own local law enforcement, with your own, every prosecutor's office here in Ohio has a victim advocate. A lot of times they have more than one. Reach out to them, introduce yourself to them and say, look, I'm one of the advocates in the disability community. I'm not sure if you're aware that this accommodation is available for crime victims with disabilities. And I just wanted to bring it to your attention. Those are things that seem like really small, but that can have a huge impact on that one case that comes through. And that advocate can say, hey, I remember Marcy telling me about this ADA paper. This might be a good case to use that for. And so I know when it comes to following up and meeting with, local representatives and stuff, we do that well as a community. So I'm saying show up and show out. This is an issue that the only way we're going to really be able to move forward is together. And so this is not something we can do by ourselves and in a vacuum, and we really do need the help. So whatever, if there's opportunities for us to speak to your groups or those kind of things, please let us know. But a big thing is we need some advocacy at the local level by our community.
And our website is adultadvocacycenters.org. I forgot to say that earlier.
Alrighty, so maybe you can put that in the chat and our viewers could see it, and maybe you can come back and give us your process of what's going on, and our girl Sherry might be on, and you can bring us some more flavor and bring it back.
In the fall, we're releasing another white paper. We're going to be doing a presentation, a webinar style again, about the forensic nurse examination being an ADA accommodation as well. So we tackled forensic interviews first in the spring, and then coming in the fall, we're going to be releasing more information about forensic nurse examinations being done by a specialized trained forensic nurse, specifically also being an accommodation that survivors can request as well. So.
All right, thanks for stirring up and keeping it cooking with us. We enjoyed you for coming on our show, and everyone tune in for our next episode of Ohio DD Talks. We got a little surprises for y'all. Let's stir it